questions. All right, and we're going to start with a question we left off with. It was question number 4. You remember in the story that Moshe sends out the 12 men, the scouts, the spies, whatever you want to call them, and he gives them an assignment. He says, I want you to go into the land and I want you to scout it out from the south.
It's goofy, that thing, yeah.
Be very thorough. And then what I want you to do is I want you, when you come back, to come back here, and in front of me and Aaron and the assembly, I want you to give me a report and tell me the salient details. What was the land like? Is it indeed a land that flows with milk and honey? Is it the land that God promised to give us? Tell me about the people who live in the land. Are they many, or are they mighty men, or are they relatively weak men? Are the cities in which they live strong and fortified, or are they open cities? Moses describes to the spies, specifies what they're to look for. And when the spies get back, they give a report of the land. Initially, they say the land that God sent us to, the land that we explored, was very, very good. Indeed, it was a land flowing with milk and honey. And here are some of the fruits from the land we brought back to show you. However, but people that we saw in the land are too strong for us. We cannot deal with them. They are too mighty for us. And they live in very strong cities, and we will not be successful if we attempt to take the land, if we attempt to fulfill this mission. You'll remember that 10 of the spies bring back a negative report about the land, and 2 of the spies, Joshua and the man called Caleb, come back. They have gone to the same land. They've gone through the same process of looking at the land, and they come back and they report differently. They say the land we saw is very, very good, and we should immediately go up and do what God has commanded us to do, which is to take possession of it. If God is with us, we will succeed. They will melt away from before us, just like the Egyptians were no match for us. So Caleb and Joshua encourage the people to go on and to continue on with their mission of conquering the land, whereas the other 10 spies told the people essentially, we cannot do it. And the people, in response to the report of the other 10 spies, essentially give up. They say to Moses, why did God bring us out here to kill us? It is better for us to go back. At least we and our children and our wives will live. And they appoint new leadership, and they prepare to return back to the land of Egypt. And at that precise moment, when the people have broken out into rebellion, suddenly, to stop the rebellion, God appears in some kind of manifestation over the tent of meeting. It is clear that God is in their presence, and God at that point ends the discussion by becoming angry. He chastises the people. He says to Moses, let me deal with them. I will wipe them out, and I will make of you a people. And Moses, who faced the revolt somewhat startled, doesn't quite know what to respond, except tries to defend the people. If you wipe them out, Lord, if you them, everybody will assume you destroyed them because you couldn't keep your promise to them to bring them into the land. So my question number 4 is the following, and with this we start. And you are free to keep yourself on mic or off mic, however you choose. But if you are coming onto mic, then just remember to unmute yourself. All right, so the question is, and right now everybody is off mic. I'm just telling you, I didn't mute you myself, so you are off mic, so you can be heard. Okay, so having said that, question number 4. What accounts for the differing reports that the spies brought back after scouting out the land of Canaan? In other words, we have 2 very different sets of reports. One report was the report of the 10 spies. The other report was the report of Joshua and Caleb, the other 2 spies. What accounts for the difference between the 2 reports that we are given? Does anybody want to tell me that? Go ahead, Lori.
Were they worried about losing their closeness to God if they revealed something that was not going to benefit them, or what they thought was not going to benefit them?
All right. Before we go into conjecturing why the reports differed, what was the nature of the difference between the 2 reports, Lori? There were 2 separate reports. One was given by the 10 spies. and one was given by Joshua and Caleb. Can you tell me briefly what
No, I don't remember.
the reports were?
I was looking through all the readings and I didn't see
Okay.
it.
Okay, does anybody want to tell me what essentially, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, one was basically, this is a good land. We're going to do real well here. God's behind us. Let's just go do it. And the 10 came back and said, gee, if we went in there, these people must be pretty powerful, and we'll have a tough time of it while we're there. And we got it pretty good right now. So let's just go back and give a bad report, and we'll have it pretty good in the desert.
Okay, that's it exactly. One report was optimistic about the results. The land was good, just like God said. We can take it if God is with us. Let's go in and do it. The other report is, yes, the land was good. However, the people inside were much too strong for us. The obstacles are too great. There's no way we can possibly take it. And therefore, we might as well just forget about it, because if we attempt to take it, the casualties will be too great. All right. So now we know the two different reports. Can someone tell me what accounts for the difference in the reports? You have two very different sets of reports. What accounts for the difference? Does anybody wonder why one group gave the positive response and the other group gave the negative? Anybody want to suggest why? Just you. Go ahead, Jerry.
I would assume that the 10 that were negative, even though they started out with a positive report regarding the land, saying it really is truly a land flowing with milk and honey, but I think they became subject to the human emotion of fear.
Okay. So Jerry's thesis is that the spies went in equally uncorrupted and undecided, that they went in with open minds. But Jerry is suggesting that 10 of the spies, when they got to the land and saw what they were up against, suddenly, Jerry, lost their courage, lost their faith, and 2 of the spies retained their faith. So Jerry says that spies went up. They were initially inclined to believe God and to accept the fact that they were going in. And it was only after going in that 10 of them came up with one report and the others. Okay, Ira, go ahead.
I got it. Yeah, I think that he wanted to prepare for worst case.
Okay, so whose word was the worst? Who was thinking?
Well, worst case for when he goes back and reports to say, hey, we may have a problem. We've got to prepare for something.
All right, but Ira, let me ask you a question. Josh and Caleb saw the same thing the other 10 spies saw. All of them objectively came into the land. They scouted it. They went through it. They looked at the same land, they saw the same fruit, they observed the same people, they observed the same cities. What causes one group to give a very depressing, negative report about the land? And what gives Joshua and Caleb their very positive?
You got an idea?
Yeah,
Carol, do you know?
Carol?
Well, I think that the 10 were negative. They're negative people. And they could not know, even though God told them, to take land and everything, they're negative. And in turn, they came back and gave a negative report.
Carol, do you think these people were negative before they actually went into the land, negative people?
No. I think that they questioned things, but I think when they saw the walls, I think that that sort of solidified their negativity.
Okay. So Carol is suggesting that the people didn't go in equally unbiased and objective. Carol is suggesting that the reason 10 of the spies saw the land the way they saw it and reported back was because they were negative in their attitudes. And when they entered the land, it only confirmed, I think that's what you're saying, Carol, it confirmed their negativity. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, Lori and then Erwin.
I think they feared the freedom and the responsibility. And there was a part that says they were, and we talked about this last week, that they were more afraid of the failure rather than the success, or was it the other way around?
Very good. All right. Clearly, they saw something that worried them. And we're going to turn right to what Lori just mentioned in just a moment. Okay, Erwin, go ahead.
May I paraphrase some of the material I read in Sachs?
Absolutely, go right ahead.
Okay. So yes, the Jews were in the desert, did not have cities, did not have dwellings, did not have arable land, did not have all the comforts that the land offered to them, that would have offered to them. But on the other hand, everything was handed to them. They didn't have to worry about anything. Everything was given to them. Had they gone into the land, they would have had to work the land. They would have had to fend for themselves. They would have had to have all the accoutrements that a society had to have to survive, and that was work. That's not easy work. That's heavy work. So I think that frightened them. That made them concerned that they might not be able to handle it, and that would be too much for them. So,
Very good.
so that is my guess, and from reading the Sachs material, was a contributing factor to their negative views.
Okay, so Erwin is seconding what Laurie says, suggests that their negativity may have been related to the fact that the kind of responsibilities, tell me if I'm saying this right, Erwin. In the desert, they had a relatively easy life learning Torah and being protected by God. You're suggesting that the realization that now they would become responsible for taking action themselves and guaranteeing success, that's what they were afraid of. You're suggesting That's what they were afraid of. All right, let me ask a question here. You heard two reports. Which reports were right? Which report was right and which report was not right? Anybody want to tell me? And it's question number 5. Which group of spies were correct in their assessment of the situation in the land of Canaan? And which group of spies delivered an unreliable report? Anybody want to take that? We have 2 sets of reports. You have suggested reasons for why the reports may have differed. But before we go into why they differed, which was reliable and which was unreliable? Anybody want to tell me?
In hindsight, the 10 that reported negatively about it, they were wrong. I mean, that's basically it.
The people who thought favorably about going into the land were wrong.
No. People report unfavorably.
Unfavorably. So you say we will never be able to determine this because they didn't go in when they were supposed to. But you said, Mike, that the people who reported will never do it. They were the ones who were wrong, and Joshua and Caleb were correct.
Right, because that's what happened.
Okay. Anybody want to take a different view than Mike's? Go ahead, Leslie, and then Jerry.
Well, you can't say they were definitely wrong because they were going to have to work and take responsibility. They were going to have to now build a nation. Nothing would be handed to them. So they were seeing it realistically in one sense.
Mhm. Leslie is saying they were realists. They looked at what we were seeing. They were, for whatever reason, afraid of going in and assuming this responsibility. And they were just as honest as Leslie, I don't want to put words in your mouth. They were just as honest in their assessment as were Joshua and Caleb in their assessment. Is that what you're saying? You can't say either one was wrong.
No.
Okay.
The only difference was the stronger belief in God, whether he was going to help them or not.
Okay, so one group had a stronger belief that God would be there fighting with them and would guarantee their success. And the other group felt, given the situation, even with God's help, it was an impossible situation. Jerry, go ahead.
This really seems to be a paradox to me because from my reading, they both agreed, the 10 and the 2, that it indeed was a land flowing with milk and honey. Yet the 10 said, this land is flowing with milk and honey, but it's going to eat us up.
Mhm.
So already they're saying something to give the rest of the people hearing these reports fear. And even though the other 2 loyal ones, Joshua and Caleb, tried to say, no, that's not true. It seems like that was enough to create all of this disturbance and lack of, let's say, real faith.
Okay, so clearly there's a difference, and it's going to be hard, Jerry is saying, to determine which report was accurate and true and which one was not. Sonia, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yes, Rabbi House. The fact that they brought fruits from the land, it just equals that what they reported, that the land was fortified. It was fertile.
Yes. So Sonia says the proof, the objective proof that the spies brought back, the fruit itself, testified to the fact that at least when God said this is a good land that sustains its inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey, that part was true. Where they disagreed was not on the question of whether it was a good land, Sonia is saying. They merely disagreed on whether or not they could take it. Now, I'm going to tell you something that seems can't possibly be true. What if I told you that both groups were absolutely right? Would you believe me?
Yes.
Both
Yes.
groups were absolutely right. Okay, and the difference has to do not with so much what they saw, but the way in which they saw it. How many of you guys watched the Super Bowl game on Sunday? Most of you. Okay, when I was watching the game, the first part of the game, I thought, well, the Eagles have it. This is the Eagles game. And I don't know what happened at halftime when they went back into the locker, but Kansas City came back and it was a whole different game. And I said to myself the following: if I had been a member of Kansas City, if I had been a chieftain, and I had gone back into the locker room, especially after the fact that they did try and seem to catch up, but they took that yardage away from them because the man had stepped out. If I had been there at halftime, regardless of what the coach said to me, would I have been able to go out and play successfully the second half if I was a Kansas City player? And it seems to me it depends. Go ahead, Lori.
Well, it made perfect sense. I thought the Eagles had it because clearly the first part of the game, they were doing really well. But then after the halftime, Kansas City was really motivated. They had nothing to lose. They had everything to gain, and they were really motivated to make a comeback.
Laura, you think it would have been different if instead of the prize for the winner of the game being the Super Bowl trophy, the prize or the punishment at the end of the game was everybody in the losing team was going to be executed? Do you think that might have made a difference?
Yeah, that would have made a difference.
All right. The
That
point is, when you're playing a game, you're both dealing with an equal incentive. The incentive is to win the trophy, to be the best, okay? Enough people have watched football games to know that in any given football game, you cannot predict the winner because sometimes the stronger team on the charts doesn't win a football game, right? Lori is right. It has to do with motivation. It has to do with all kinds of other factors, referee calls, whatnot. So the point is, if all that's on the line, Lori, is that if you win the game, you win everything. And if you lose the game, you lose the game, but you might as well try for it because what have you got to lose anyway? You're going to win or lose anyway. You might.
But for them,
Yes.
Rabbi, but for them, winning is everything.
Is everything. All right.
It's totally everything for them.
Do you think it's possible to be so afraid if you're behind, so afraid of losing that you go out and completely make yourself ineffective on the field, Lori?
It's very possible.
Very possible. All right, here's the question. Our perceptions are our perceptions. You cannot say they're right or they're wrong. I get frustrated when I argue with people because so often I'm convinced that I see things exactly the way they're supposed to be, and I can't convince the other people to see the reality my way. But then I think about it and I say to myself, no, they're probably equally convinced. When we see what we perceive to be the truth of a situation, we are so convinced that our perception is correct. And it so affects us, even if we don't think it does, it so affects us that psychologically it is already working for us or against us even before we start, okay? The spies who came in with a negative view, who were negative, probably would have come out of that visit with a negative report under any circumstances, because they were confronted by a situation where their fears were confirmed. What they saw was enough to convince them that they couldn't do it. And therefore, because they were convinced that they could not be successful, they could not be successful. Now, I don't know if this makes sense to you. If you have convinced yourself you cannot do something before you've done it, you're probably a good way toward failing, okay? By the same token, if you are enthusiastic, even if the odds are against you, even if it seems stacked against you, even if logic tells you there's no way you can possibly win. But if you go into sports or you go into battle and you have this feeling about you, which is why people give speeches before battles, and you rouse the people up and you give them the confidence they need, they can go into battle against incredible odds and they can be victorious. The truth is that the objective situation was true for both groups of reporters the way they saw it. They exactly saw it correctly. The only difference between them was one group actually had faith that God would be with them.
Yep.
Joshua and Caleb, it wasn't that they didn't see the same things. They wasn't that they didn't see these strong men in these fortified cities and these large armed troops. It was that they truly believed, after everything they had experienced, they truly believed that if the God of Israel was fighting at their side, there was nothing they could not do. And therefore, looking at the same evidence as the other spies, they said to the people, let us go up immediately. Let us take the land. It is given to us. If God is with us, then whatever advantages they have will not avail them. We will take the land. In their mind, the thought of defeat, the possibility of not succeeding was not there.
Yeah.
Okay. It doesn't mean that they were necessarily more realistic, if you want to use those terms. It just means they were much more highly motivated. Anybody want to respond to that? I mean, in general, I mean, whether you want to apply it to warfare or games or whatever. Okay, Erwin and then Lori.
Well, I think that if you look at the history of human development, you will find that optimists were always in the minority, but that progress has always relied on optimists moving forward, and I think that we saw the same thing back then. I don't think that we've changed all that much in terms of human behavior.
What Erwin says is very important. And I'm a student of ancient battles, not so much athletic contests, but ancient battles. And I remember what Henry V and the English faced on the plains of Agincourt in the 1500s when they came up amongst a much greater, much better armed French army, which included extensive cavalry, and they managed to win. Now, here is the interesting thing. How do I want to put this? I want to put this in the right way. You can inspire people only so much, you know, when that's why armies, when they go to war, they make noise, and, you know, you see the armies come on the field. And if there's a real big disparity of armies, it can demoralize the people. I'm sure that in those of you who were with me in the book of Samuel, when the Israelites saw the champion Goliath come out, Goliath stood about 2 times the size of any man. And Goliath is there and he challenges any individual Israelite to individual combat with the offer that if he wins, the Philistines will take over, and if Israel wins, they will take over. There wasn't an Israelite there who wanted to face Goliath on the field of battle. No right-thinking person looking at this giant, this man of war who had been trained in war from his youth, would dare to believe that in single face-to-face combat, he could prevail against Goliath, except this naive young man who was a shepherd, who knew that he was pretty good with a slingshot and had managed to chase off wild beasts before. He believed it could be done. He had the same kind of naive, if you want to call it, faith in God. He said, this man is challenging the God of Israel. He is taunting the God of Israel and our king. If God is with us, I have no need to fear him. If God is determined to take him down, he will take him down by my hand. And that is the truth. That is the truth. And I try and imagine myself. I can't imagine being in a battle. I can, but I'm not doing anything very glorious and valiant. I'm hanging back. I can't imagine being in a great athletic competition. Again, I'm not doing anything great. But I could imagine myself if I were fighting in 1948 in one of the ill-defended kibbutzim in the South, and the Egyptian army in all its might came up, armored and with all kinds of troops and weapons and even planes to support them. Would I have been able, like the defenders of the kibbutz, to stand there to the last man and try and stop the Egyptian army in their tracks, which in fact is exactly what they did? The truth is, I would like to believe that I would, but I'm not sure I would. But the Israelis had one thing going for them in the 48 war that the Arabs did not have going for them. And is expressed in the Hebrew term, ein breira. Ein breira. You know what ein breira means?
No.
There's no choice. No choice. When you are faced with the situation where you know the enemy is not going to yield, where there's not going to be mercy on the battlefield, when you know that you're fighting for your wives and your children, who will be the next individuals who will be subjected to this terrible fate if you and your comrades sitting on the onward at the forward outpost fall. If there is literally ein breira, you have no choice but to fight and do what you can to stop the enemy. Love is stronger than anger. If you are fighting for your family, for your freedom, for your tradition, for your honor, fighting for positive reasons, when there is no choice, it can be tremendously compelling. Gail, go ahead, and then Marlene. Oh, did you have anything, Gail, that you wanted to say? No, oh, Marlene, go ahead.
No, as you're saying this, I'm thinking about the Ukrainians, how they're fighting, and they're talking about the Russians and how they thought they were going to walk in and take it over, but they're basically saying how they're fighting for their lives, they're fighting for their families, and I see it as this very similar thing to the Israeli war and to it's basically the same thing. What I don't understand, Ron, and this is what gets me, they were given, I mean, if I was there with them in the desert and God had given me the 10 commandments and God had given me everything, he parted the Red Sea, he did everything, I would have such great faith that I would, if God said to go there, that the land is ours, I would believe it. I don't understand. It's just, that's really the hard part for me, is to understand why they didn't have the faith. I mean, it was only a year, but if I had been.
Let's answer Marlene's question. She said, and I believe you, Marlene, and I would like to believe that I would be the same way.
Okay.
You were. Would like to believe it. I'm not sure I would, but I'd like to believe it. If I had witnessed God taking a slave people, my people, out of Egypt amid signs and wonders, what these natural events, if I had witnessed how we had managed to survive for 50 days in the wilderness until we arrived at Sinai, if I had witnessed God speaking to the people, if I had witnessed the manna from heaven and the provisions and the water that was given, I would like to believe, after seeing all those things for a period of time, I would be an absolute believer. But there is another phenomenon, Marlene, that I can't help but think about too, and that's called, this is expressed in the expression, what have you done for me lately?
Oh gosh, really?
What have you done for me lately? And what this means is miracles have a certain power, Marlene, a certain convincing power, but tend to dissipate. They tend to, over time, they dissipate. Now remember, the Jewish people had been sitting at Mount Sinai for about 1 year and they had not been fighting any battles. The question that I want to ask you, Marlene, is if it had been about a year since God had last done all those miracles for you, would you still have maintained your mind and your heart based on what you had seen a year before? Would you still be confident, Marlene, that God was with you?
Not sure, because honestly, thinking about it, they were slaves. That was their lives. They didn't know. For them, it was, I guess, they weren't, they didn't have that faith. I mean, they said can take generations to
So
get that.
That's true. Marlene is saying something very important. They had been schooled in freedom and miracles and God's intercession for 1 year. They had been instilled with slavery for 210 years.
Yeah.
Which lesson is going to take effect? After a year of sitting in the desert, away from all enemies, educating, learning a new way of life, after a year of not having to face personal challenges, of being given, as someone said, everything, given their daily food, given their camp, given their protection, given everything. After 1 year of a relatively secure life, and then I'm going to get Neil, would they, well, Lori and Neil, would they have reverted to their original slave mentality of 210 years training?
Yep.
Or would they have kept their 1 year? Lori and then Neil. Go ahead, Lori.
So getting back to what Erwin was talking about, that research has shown that attitudes play a really big part in the outcomes of events. And you can be self-defeating, you can be passionate. It all depends on your frame of mind. But again, with these people, we're coming from an educated frame of reference. They're not educated. They just go based on what they had been living every day and what God had told them and what their experiences were. So I think it's really hard for us to say we knew how they felt, because I personally don't think I could really put myself into their position because I know too much. But I just think that they had to come to that conclusion of what they needed to do over a period of time.
And what Lori is saying is, even if they believe that God had fought for them earlier on, Lori is saying maybe, but how would I know that God was still on my side? How would I know that God was still fighting for me? I know what God has done, but maybe over the course of time, I or the people have done something to forfeit God's protection. Maybe they would have thought, Lori is suggesting, that despite the evidence of what God has done when he was with us, maybe God isn't with us any longer. Okay. Neil, go ahead, and then Erwin.
I'm thinking of it as, do we doubt ourselves today? Do we believe that God is with us and helping us? And ultimately, you know, we've talked about it as passive observers of the past, but who on this call have had crisis of faith, or it doesn't even occur to you that you are being protected by God in today's world.
And Neil, you're right. We're tested every single day. In a sense, whatever life throws at us is a test. It would be nice to believe, as Neil suggests, that maybe having survived previous tests, confidence in the test that we have not faced yet, that it will turn out well. But this is speculative. What Neil is saying is, this isn't the theoretical question. This is a real question. In our life today, would we behave any differently when we confront, on the one hand, the seeming reality of the odds of the situation? Would we believe that mere faith or belief is enough to compensate for the disadvantages which we see? Erwin, go ahead. You can respond to that.
Well, the point I wanted to make was that during that intervening year, the people had experienced such powerful examples of divine existence and intervention. It would have been, I don't know, for me, it would have been absolutely difficult not to believe that it would continue. It was just way too much power to allow myself to go back and say, no, this wasn't true. That's just me.
No, and believe me, Erwin, I do that in my life too. You know, the most miraculous thing I've ever seen in my life personally, watching my wife give birth. Okay, no, seriously. being there when the baby was born. I think that is the most miraculous thing of the world. But you know how long that impact lasts, or how long the miracle, when miracles become more common, more regular, you begin to take them for granted. I lived the year after Israel was created. But I once asked my grandfather what was the greatest miracle he'd ever seen in his life. And he lived before there were airplanes. He lived before there was communication. You could pick up a phone, or you could look at a person halfway across the world and talk to them in real time. And I said, so Grandpa, of all the wondrous miracles you've seen, what was the greatest miracle you saw? And he said, the creation of Israel.
Oh,
And I said, what do you mean the creation of Israel? I can explain that. The unity of the Jewish people, ain't no choice, arms supply, diplomatic support. Then you don't understand. He said, other miracles you can explain by technology and ability. He said, but I lived in a time when the state of Israel didn't exist, when it was only a dream. And then I watched all my family murdered in Europe during the course of the Second World War, so that at the end in 1945, I thought it was the end of the story of the Jewish people. So when I saw Israel facing the odds it was facing, with the world betting that it was not going to last, it was going to be driven into the sea, when I saw Israel survive, he said, that was the greatest miracle I ever saw in my life. And who can gainsay that? Now, Erwin, if I saw a miracle like that, I would say to you, that would be enough to convince me, right? And yet in 1956, and again in 1967, when Israel was faced with other challenges, and it looked again as if it was going to be an impossible situation, there were a lot of Israelis who, despite the fact that they had seen 1948, were uncertain whether it was going to turn out well in 56 and 67. So I guess the question, Erwin, is, if you had seen these miracles occur, would you necessarily have had the faith to believe that another miracle was right around the corner and was going to happen? Is that enough to convince you or Lori or any of us that because God had acted once and had saved us, he was going to act again? Is it?
Yeah, well, but you know, there were so many examples of miracles. It wasn't just one or two
Okay.
or three. They just kept coming and coming and coming.
Okay.
That's my feeling.
All right. All right. So
But
now
you
let's.
never know when the next miracle is going to come. You think, oh, I've got this one, I should be thankful. But we can't predict the future. We just don't know if another one's going to come. We can hope, but you just don't know.
Lori is saying we sing the Dayenu every year. We thank God for bringing us out of Egypt. If he brought us out of Egypt, it would have been enough. If he had brought us through the Red Sea, it would have been enough. If he had brought us to Mount Sinai, it would have been enough. If he had given us the 10 commandments, it would have been enough. If he had brought us to the land of Israel, and it would have been enough. But lo and behold, God did this and this and this and this and this. You know, the question is, how long can you keep a winning streak going, Lori? How long can you keep the good fortune going? But you're absolutely right. Even if you see that miracles have happened, are you bold enough, or do you have enough chutzpah to believe that God is going to continue to favor you, that you're going to continue on and enjoy success? Do you worry that maybe you've run out of your success, that you've run out of your good luck? Now, I don't have an answer to these questions. Believe me, I'm not I'm not trying to be clever. Neil, go ahead.
Maybe I'm getting all religious or anything, but having Bible study tonight, would that be enough? In other words, we are experiencing a miracle right now as we're doing what we're doing, as we're studying Torah, as we're breathing our next breath. And so I think the miracles are here every moment. Every other breath that you take is a miracle.
Very good, Neil. And by the way, let me argue the counterpoint, which Neil, thank God, did not argue. But in the midst of terrible things that happened to the Jewish people after so many different events over centuries and millennia, the Jewish people would have been well to have said, why do we bother going on? At what point do you give up? At what point, facing one calamity after another, do you simply say, it can't go on anymore? You know, Neil is saying after success, we build up a record, we have faith in success. But at the same time, we tell people when the world is dark and black and suffering comes, don't give up hope, never give up hope. So we say, believe success when it comes, but don't believe failure when it comes? And how do we know what's the sign? All right, let's now go into the meat of the question of today. I've got the last two questions. All right. Both groups of spies delivered a true report. Both groups of spies reported things as they saw them, but they saw them very, very differently based on the kind of people that they were and the situations they came from. Now, the next question is, which group of spies was believed by the people? This is an easy question for everybody. Which group was believed by the people and which group was not believed? And everybody, I'll do a hands-on. How many of you believe that the winners of the argument between the 10 and the 2 was the 2? Joshua and Caleb. How many of you believe that the result of the dispute between the tribes was that the 10 tribes were believed and the 2 tribes were not believed? All right. We know that clearly, okay? And we know that psychologically. When everybody seems to be falling on the same side of an argument, when everybody seems to be saying whatever the argument is, we divide up and people express their opinions and more people reconfirm the impossibility of a situation. It tends to confirm the original report. It tends to confirm our fears and our hesitations. And so that's the way in which we move. There is no doubt that the Jewish people, at the moment they made that choice, no doubt that they believed that by choosing not to go ahead and enter the land and attempt to conquer it, that they were choosing the life-sustaining choice, that they were choosing to live, to keep their children alive, their wives alive, that by going back to Egypt and suing for peace, that they were making the right decision, okay? I believe that when they suggested that, even though it was counter to everything that God had told them, they believed that given the objective facts, that they were making the right decision. So given that understanding, given the understanding that the people believed the 10 sets of spies and they decided to do the logical thing, then let me ask you the following question, because this is immediately questioned by something that happens. You remember what happens at the end of the story. God appears to the people, to Moses and the people, and he says to Moses, Moses, leave me alone. I'm going to wipe this people out. I'm going to make you and your offspring a people instead, and just leave me alone and let me deal with this people. And Moses stands up and says, God, you cannot do that. If you destroy your people now, it will be said by the Egyptians and by the other nations round about that the only reason they didn't come into the land was not because of the sin that they committed, but because you were powerless to do it. You lack the ability, God. If you don't bring them in now, no one is going to believe that that was a punishment for their disobedience. Everybody's going to think you couldn't pull it off, that in the end you couldn't pull off the miracle. God, please save them. And God is convinced, right? God says, you know what, Moses? You've said the right things. I will not destroy this people. However, there's got to be a consequence. And the consequence is that this people who refuse to go up and into the land and take possession, they're not getting away with scot-free. They will suffer exactly what they claim to fear. They will die in the wilderness, and their children, who they were afraid would be taken captive, their children will go in after they're all dead. When Moses reports this back to the people do something very strange, given the fact that they are very afraid. What do the people do the moment Moses tells them, all right, you guys, you got your wish. God is so angry at you, is so furious that you disregarded his word and that you chose to go back to the Egypt that God had redeemed you from, that God says, fine, let them stay, let them continue to live in the wilderness, whatever, but they're all going to die here in the wilderness. What is the people's reaction to that fate announced by Moses? Do you remember what the people say to Moses?
Mm-hmm.
We changed our mind, Moses. We want to go in. We're ready to go in. We're ready to now go up. The thing that they were fearful to do, to go into the land and take it, they were now prepared to go up and to do the exact thing just hours maybe before they had said that they were afraid to do. Now they were ready to do it. Suddenly the people, and they not only are prepared to do it, they go up and they do it despite the fact that Moses says, don't do it, guys. You've already made your decision. God has already heard your complaint. He has already delivered the consequence. If you attempt to go up, you will go up without God's protection, without his help, without any kind of support, and it will be a disaster for you. But the people, nevertheless, having heard Moses warn them not to, go up anyway. Why did the people suddenly go up? Where did they suddenly find this bravery, this courage that they didn't have just shortly before? Anybody want to tell me where that comes from?
I think at this point, they build resilience and they become strong inside and the faith they want them.
What was it that did it, Sonia? I agree with you. Suddenly they seem to have changed. They said, Moses, we changed our mind. We weren't prepared to go up, but even though we haven't learned any other facts, we've got the spies reports, now we're willing to. What suddenly gave them, Sonia, the, as you put it, resilience, the courage to go in?
Because they have faith that no matter what they were there, it was not scary anymore. It was the faith to God that they will survive.
Okay, so suddenly they had faith is what you're suggesting. They suddenly changed. Erwin, do you buy that?
No, I don't.
All right. So what
I believe they were frightened. I think they realized they bit the hand that's been feeding them a little too hard. And they decided that that was taking a chance. They decided to stay with the manna.
They were still afraid. I grew up in a house where we coined the expression, wait till your father gets home. By the way, my father rarely ever touched us. The real disciplinarian in our home was my mother. And she didn't resort to straps and beatings and whatnot. She was a pincher. God forbid you fell afoul of my mother, who was much more spontaneous and much more passionate. When my mom lost it, she lost it. I mean, I won't even tell you all the stories. But the thought was, if we did something really terrible, what would mom say? She wouldn't do a thing. Go to your room. Your dad will take care of it when he comes home. It was different. We weren't so afraid of our mom anymore. We were suddenly afraid of dad, because usually when that was said, that meant the punishment was going to be terrible. It was going to be dire. The Jewish people were asked by Moses and God, go into the land, take it. They say, okay, but let's send people out to spy it out. They spy it out. The spies come back. The spies say, guys, we can't do it. It's impossible. The people are, Erwin says, frightened. We can't do it. We're not going in. Why does God want to kill us? No sooner does the punishment come down, Moses says, all right, guys, you made your bed. God says you're going to die in the wilderness. You don't have a chance to go in. Suddenly the alternative kicks in. I'm afraid, I'm more afraid of getting God angry at me. I just turned around and I gave a yes to God who did all these miracles. Suddenly they're now afraid of God's reaction. Anybody want to respond to that? Okay, Mark and then Lori.
Yeah, just to tag on to that line of reasoning, it's almost like the immediacy of the fear was there with the option to go in and attack, and so they didn't think about it. But then when God came down with this, his judgment, it was kind of slap in the face of reality, and they kind of woke up to what the choices really were. And I think that's what would cause that change of heart.
Very good, Mark. The choices are no longer between going in and not going in, risking your life in war and maybe staying out of the war and going back to Egypt or making some other arrangement. Suddenly, as Mark says, the choice has been made for you. You guys lost the choice. You're not going in. You're going to die in the wilderness. Suddenly, you can't avoid the choice anymore. The choice that looked so fearful, Mark, is now not a choice anymore. The choice has been taken away from you. God says, you've pronounced your own doom, Israel. You have said you're not going in, and that's what's going to happen. You're not going in. The choice isn't yours anymore. Suddenly, they find the courage to what they didn't have the courage to do when the choice was there. Oh, no, 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 we made a mistake, God. We'll go in, we'll do it. Even though Moses says to them, don't do it, you're just as disobedient now going in against God's express wishes as you were before not going in, okay? And yet, something has happened. The finality of God's judgment, you're not going to go in. You've spoken your own doom, you will die here. Suddenly the people realize that they have lost in a moment what they could have had, and now they're ready to go in. Let's see, who is the other person who was there? I saw somebody, Lori, go ahead.
It's just the same thing that you had said, like either my son or my students would do something wrong and they knew what the consequence was. And it's like, okay, here's your consequence. No, 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 I take it back. I'll go back, because they know that doing what they should have done in the first place is not as bad as what the consequence was, but they didn't realize that. And they probably didn't believe me that I would go through with it, but they realized that what they should have done in the first place wasn't as bad as what the consequence would.
Very good, Lori. You held your guns, you said, fine, that's the consequence. And now suddenly they were willing to do whatever they had to do to renegotiate however they could to turn that decision around that they had made just a short while before. It convinced you that they have changed. It convinced you that it was just a momentary lapse. I didn't really mean it.
I gave you some.
I gave into a moment of weakness. I now realize what I should do. I now realize the error of my ways. Just give me one more chance to correct it. The problem with God is here, there was no more chance, Lord.
Oh, you're frozen.
Oh, God.
Oh,
Or anybody.
Okay, Rabbi, snap out of it.
Hello, Ray.
Oh, gosh.
Gail's still
now
here.
he's just- okay.
Oh,
he's
there he
back.
goes. You were
My-
just frozen.
Okay, did you lose everything I did?
Yeah, we lost it.
Basically, all I said was, hold on just a second. Okay, basically, what I said was, when the consequence was announced, like children, they did anything they could to reverse the consequence because they didn't want to have to accept then and there the fact that they had made the wrong choice. And they were willing to promise to be completely different so long as I would give them another chance, okay? If I did not give them another chance, then they have to admit that they made the wrong choice. That in a moment of weakness, they chose the wrong thing to do. Now, all this having been said, we still have to ask one last question, and this is the question of the night.
Right.
And the question has two answers, and you read them both in Sachs. I'm going to give you Sachs's two answers, and I'm going to ask you which one seems more convincing. These are the two answers that Sachs gave. If you read Sachs, you know the answers he gave. One is an answer that was suggested by no less than the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the great Rebbe of Lubavitch, Chabad rabbi. And in answer to his followers' questions, the same questions you guys had, how can those people who have spent 11, 12, 13 months with God in the wilderness, had seen his power in Egypt, how could they suddenly doubt him at the critical moment? It doesn't make sense to believe that they thought they were going to fail. Everything that had happened, God had promised and he had fulfilled it. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe's answer was, they weren't afraid of failure. They were afraid of success. Now, let me explain that to you for a moment, okay? They had just spent a year in the desert. It was an easy existence. They didn't have to work. They had their flocks. They had their herds. Didn't have to worry about food. Every morning they got up and gathered the manna in. They had everything they wanted, protection and everything, and they got to spend daylight hours studying Torah. Remember Tevye? If I were rich, I'd have the time that I lack to sit in the synagogue and pray and maybe have a seat by the Eastern Wall. And I discuss the holy books with the learned men. The Israelites were living an ideal existence. They were being tutored by the best tutor of all. And I don't mean Moses, I mean God, but through Moses, God through Moses, they were living the life. They had food, they had everything. They had freedom from outside persecution and oppression. What's more, they had had a year to forget about the torments and the terribleness of Egypt. They had been gone from Egypt so long, they fantasized about what a wonderful land Egypt was. They didn't forgot about the beatings and the slave masters and the killing of the firstborn. Only they could only remember that they had onions and leeks and fresh fruit and vegetables when they lived in the land of Egypt. Okay. Now suddenly they were being told, guys, now you've got to do something for yourself. Now you've got to take on responsibility. Not only do you have to take on responsibility to go into the land and fight for it and take it in battle, but then you've got to build houses or take possession of the houses that are there. You've got to plant the fields. You've got to take your flocks in. You've got to handle the economy. You've got to deal with 1,001 everyday minor issues that are involved in living. You cannot just sit back anymore studying Torah. You can study Torah, but you must deal with living in the land. You must now farm it and work it and protect it. You must now assume responsibility. You must become leaders. You must make decisions. You can't sit back with clean hands anymore. You got to get your hands dirty. You got to take responsibility. That's one choice. Or God says, if you like this life, you can stay here in the wilderness. You can study Torah and you can have me take care of you. And here you won't have to worry about enemies, or you won't have to worry about other nations tempting you to their idolatry. You'll have a perfect life. How many of us would choose the easier life? You don't have to raise your hand. How many of us would choose not to take on the responsibility? How many of us would say, thank you, God, very much, but I can't imagine how living and having to assume day-to-day responsibilities and tasks and meeting the monthly payments and paying the mortgage and dividing the land and dealing with bad weather and bad crops. I can't imagine how that could be better than sitting and studying Torah with you all day and being taken care of. Thanks, God, but this business about taking responsibility, not for me. I don't want it. And God forbid we should go and we should take it. And then we have to worry about all the other things that come with governing a land. That's one theory. That was the Rabbi Schneerson theory, that they were afraid of success, that they preferred to live in the wilderness in the presence of God, constantly employed in divine tasks without having to get their hands dirty with the real world. The other answer, which is suggested by the following chapter, is no. Despite everything that God had done for them, and I agree with all of you, I want to believe that I would have been a believer. If God had done all those miracles, I want to be able to say, like Lori and maybe Erwin, I'd have accepted it. After seeing all that evidence, all that, I'd have been a believer. I'd have accepted, but I don't know that I would have. And the second essay said, freedom doesn't come from God intervening suddenly and intensely over a short period of time. Freedom has to develop slowly. Freedom takes time. You must experience in small portions responsibility. You must learn. And especially if you guys are right, and that everything was handed to them in the wilderness, who wants to go from an existence where everything is handed to you free and now have to be responsible for providing it for yourself, your defense, your security, your prosperity? Who would want to take that on? And if it is true that after a year of not having confronted any enemies, they had forgotten the miracles earlier, maybe they were just plain afraid that they were not the people to go in. Maybe despite everything God had given them, they weren't confident. Now, I'm going to do a one vote, and then you have a chance to defend your position. You can say that the people were afraid of success or they were afraid of failure. Both answers have good arguments for them. How many of you believe that the people at the critical moment chose not to go into the land and to fight for it and to conquer it and to take responsibility for governing? How many of you believe that was a failure caused by their fear that they would succeed? Hands. Okay. How many of you believe it was a failure that was caused by their fear that they weren't going to succeed. All right, based on an honest democracy, we would have to say the majority. All right, so now this is the place where we argue out this last part of it. Gail, you're shaking your head. You can go first.
There's so many things in my head, but I guess I think that that Rabbi Sachs convinced me in the reading that it wasn't so much a matter of faith, it was a matter of what kind of person you are. You know, like we talk about the glass being half full and half empty. He used the phrase a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. And I just don't think that people, not only were they not ready, I can see them being more afraid to succeed rather than to fail. Because, and I can't even explain it right. It's just that would have been so much responsibility on their heads that they hadn't had for 200 years, that it made sense to me that they were more afraid to succeed than to fail.
Hal, you were there. You would have been one of those men. And if you had failed, you would have seen your wife and your children taken captives or suffered death or a fate worse than death. Would you have hesitated?
Would I what?
Would you have hesitated?
Would you have hesitated to
No.
go in and conquer the land?
Yeah, I'm right.
All right. I just want honesty. I want honesty, guys. All right. It's not just my existence. When I go to war and I leave my wife and my children back in the home country behind the front lines, I'll fight like hell, because the only thing that's going to protect my wife and my children when they're safe behind in the encampment is the fact that I'm going to fight for them, and I'm going to give everything I can to make sure that the enemy never gets anywhere near the people I love. I could give my life easier than I could stand watching the enemy storm my land and take my wife and my children. That would be worse for me, okay? I'm telling you how I would feel. So imagine now the Israelites, they're going to go in, they're going to conquer the land, they're all going to go in, but if they don't succeed, now the price you're going to pay is not just your death because you went in to fight the enemy, you're going to watch your wife and your children die too. You're going to see Masada reenacted before your eyes. How many of us would have the courage to do that? All right, go ahead, Leslie.
I think it's interesting that it was an 8-2.
10 to 2.
10 to 2. Well,
10,
but
10,
let's
5.
Because I think that the majority of people, if they're in a situation like this, it might be something like 80% and 20%. Because, and I guess it would be, I don't even know how much it would be faith, but like you're saying, if I think from just personally, and since I'm not the head of a family and I don't have children and everything, I would want to see, I would be curious. I would want to go and see the land of milk and honey, you know, as opposed to thinking the other way. And I think that the way the division with the two that saw it one way and the rest of them seeing it the other almost balances out what even today, what if we were all to pick how many out of this group, how many of us would say, I'm going, and the rest would stay? And I bet it would be that lopsided.
Possibly. And remember, we're just ordinary people. The ones who went in where it was so lopsided, these were leading men of each of the tribes. The men who went in were already specially selected for being leaders. So if regular people like us might have doubted, you know, it's amazing that these leaders were also concerned. All right. So any other responses? Go ahead, Jerry.
Rabbi, at the end of last week's meeting, you kind of posed this question regarding, could we look at it as 30 years, 39 years due to punishment, or was it necessary, inevitable? So now, after this past week, previously, I thought it was punishment. But now, I believe you're leading us to make the conclusion that this is inevitable. Because now the next reading is going to show for sin offering that man is imperfect. He needs a law covenant. He's got to make amends for his sins. So I think that God was really trying to show Moses that, look, this people's gonna fail.
All right. I wouldn't have pushed you, Jerry, to that conclusion. I would never do that as your teacher. But if you ask me, I also don't see this necessarily as punishment as much as I see that this is a very clear indication given in a clear way by the people themselves. They pronounced their own fate, that they were not ready to go in, that they were not ready to assume the burdens of leadership. And God couldn't tell them that. God couldn't say you're not ready, because they would have said, what do you mean we're not ready? We're ready, we'll go in. He had to let them make the decision, and they had to decide not to go in. Now, here is the clincher, okay? And I will give you, and then I'll let us argue left. The very end of this Torah portion talks about a Jewish ritual object. You know what ritual object is talked about at the end of this Torah portion? Tzitzit, fringes.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
you all know what tzitzit are, don't you?
Yeah,
Right,
why do they
right.
talk?
Tzitzit are at the end of a talit. They're the fringes. And God says to Moses, command the Jewish people to put fringes on their garments throughout their generation. And up the fringe of each corner, let them place a thread of blue. Why? For what purpose? That they may look upon it and remember all of the commandments of the Lord to do them. And that they go not about after their own eyes and their own heart and their own eyes, after which they go astray. What was the tzitzit supposed to do? God was saying something important.
Remember everything that's happened so far.
Yeah. What leads us astray is our eyes. It's the way we see the world. That's why Judaism has never been a people that said, see, O Israel. Seeing is deceptive. Seeing, you'll never see the right situation. They say, understand, listen, hear, O Israel. Seeing is always delusional. I see a situation, I look at it, I say, this is impossible, and I go astray. I can't trust it, I can't do it. The fringes were given to us to remind us that when I see something that looks like I can't do it, not to follow my own heart and my own eyes, which lead me astray, but rather to look upon the fringe and to remember that God is with me, okay? The whole idea behind tzitzit is to strengthen the Jewish people, lo taturu, that you should not go astray. That's what the spies did. When they went into the land of Israel to spy out the land, they weren't called spies, meraglim. They went into the land latur, to travel through it and to visit it, to tour it, okay? The word for a tour, to tour the land, latur, is the same word for to go astray. The spies went into the land to tour
Wow.
what it was like. And they saw what they wanted to see, or what they thought they were going to see, or what they feared to see. And they came back, and based on what they were afraid of, they gave a bad report about the land. It was so bad that it scared all the Israelites away, and they went astray, and they didn't follow God. At the end of the portion Shalach, God says to Moses, tell the people never again to base their decisions on what appears to be right, because that will only lead you astray. Lo taturu, you shall not go astray after your own eyes and your own heart, which lead you astray. In other words, you will see what you will see, your heart will deceive you, and you will give up the battle before it's won. Because you are all Jews, I don't have to tell you that the survival of the Jewish people for 700 years, whatever, is an improbable story. If you wanted to take a vote, or you wanted to bet and lay odds 3,700 years ago, knowing what was going to happen, how many of you think the Jewish people would survive? I doubt we'd even have 10% of you feel we were going to make it. The reasonable odds would have been for you to say there's no way they can do it. Nations greater than us, nations mightier than us, nations more sophisticated and with more advantages than our people, who aren't hated by a lot of other people, would not have assumed to make it, okay? Ancient Egypt is gone. Babylonia is gone. Sumeria is gone. The Hellenists are gone. Ancient Rome is gone. All the empires in the world that don't exist anymore. Why? What right does a little people who was never very big in numbers and constantly impressed, What gives them the chutzpah to think that they're going to stay here and going to be here and are going to outsurvive everybody else in the world? The truth is, if you were an honest person, you were better, none of you would have taken the odds of the 3,700-year game of Jewish history. Even if they gave you 100 to 1 odds, 1,000 to 1 odds, you would have been crazy to take the odds. It wasn't a good bet unless you were firm believers that you were betting nothing, that the God of Israel was by your side. Okay? Because if you are absolutely certain that you will be protected and absolutely believe that God is with you, then it doesn't matter what the physical world, what the material world throws against you, it cannot defeat you. It cannot stand in your face. That is the miraculous nature of Jewish survival. That's the real miracle, okay? I didn't mean, Jerry, to suggest, I wanted you to be tolerant of that generation. If anything, I didn't want you to look at them as being punished for being terrible sinners. They were ordinary, everyday human beings who had spent a couple hundred years as slaves, and they just weren't ready to assume the responsibility of going in with all that hung in the balance. They had no Jewish history to look back on and say, we've done this for 3,700 years. Their only history was being a family in Canaan and being slaves for 200 years. It is completely natural that the people made the decision that they made. But because they made the wrong decision, which led to this terrible consequence, for our final two sessions, we are going to look at the last great revolt, which will spell the people's final fall, okay? They fall here. They fall victim to wandering for 39 more years, but God did not say he was leaving them. He did not say he would not be in their midst. He did not say to Moses, fine, no more manna, no more wells, no more protection, no more cloud. God didn't say any of that. God said to Moses, fine, Moses, you've told me to have patience with the people. You told me the nations on the outside won't understand why I'm doing this. Fine. Tell the people of Israel, I'm not going to destroy them. Tell them I think they made a terrible choice, but tell them I'm not going to punish them, that this wandering is not so much a punishment as the result of the fact that they're not ready yet. I'll bring their children in when they're ready to come in. And that was the test. What would the Jewish people now, knowing that they had been that close to the land, literally on the borders, they were literally there, they could have gone in and taken it. Everything would have been perfect right then and there. When you lose Shangri-La, when you lose heaven in a second, what happens to you? What does it do to your soul? What does it do to your discipline? I'm going to suggest it causes you to revolt big time, as we're going to see when we read chapter 16. Okay, everybody, you're free to respond. Go ahead, Gail.
What I find fascinating is that this all comes back to something we've discussed so many times, particularly in Genesis, and that is that God made us, created us with free will and choice, because he could have, there's so many things he could have done. He could have, as I think Rabbi Sachs suggested, he could have given us the self-confidence to go into the land without even thinking twice about it. But that would have been the same issue that we've talked about so many times. We are not robots. We have freedom of choice. And this is just another example of a poor choice. And we're still making sometimes good choices as a people, and sometimes bad choices. And hopefully we learn from them.
Right. As parents, as teachers, we cannot force our children or our students to accept what is good for them because we say it's good for them. We must let them make the choices themselves, understanding that freedom entails making bad choices. Okay. By the way, you're going to love the next course because I'm going to tackle the question of why does God let us do that anyway? My son and I are going to ask the ultimate question. Knowing how suffering and how pain have affected the world, why did God ever build that into the world? Why did God ever make the world that way? If God truly loved us, why would he place us in a world where suffering and pain were necessary? Couldn't he have found a way of extracting us from all that, of giving us a different kind of a life? You're going to be surprised at the answer, but that's what we'll tackle the next course. Okay.
I can tell you one thing that you told our son in Hebrew school when you discussed why so many people in the world hungry. And I still remember you told Scott and the rest of the class that there's more than enough food in the world. It's the choices that people make as to whether, so in other words, God has provided, the earth has food, but the choices that governments and people make is what causes people to go hungry.
And that's still the answer. And by the way,
She's good.
Turkey and Syria. What's the latest count? 36,000 people. I am telling you, it did not have to turn out that way. I'm not telling you that in an earthquake, there wouldn't have been disasters. There would have been. The forces of nature, which are not in our control, are beyond us and they exert us their strength. A lot of what happens, a lot of the disaster that comes upon the world is not because we humans are incapable of mitigating suffering. It's because for all kinds of reasons, we choose not to respond to it. And that is the harshest lesson of all. It is not an inability to feed people that keeps the world hungry. It is not an inability to make peace and resolve problems that keeps the world at war. It is a human choice not to. Our illness, our suffering, our pain often is inflicted on us ourselves. And that, I think you're right, Gil. All right, everybody. I wish I had a better lesson for you here, but that is it. All right, now here's the next week's lesson. Okay, we go back now to our regular reading. Read the reading for the last reading. We are now going to read chapter, I believe it is chapter 16. Let me just take a look here. Yes,
We listened to.
13, 14, 15, we ended with the Talit, yes, Korach, chapter 16, and let me see how long it goes.
Is this the book of Numbers from our house?
This is the book of Numbers. So this is everybody who has a Chumash, 5 books of Moses, you can do this, all right?
Okay, thank you.
All you have to read is chapters 16 and 17,
Oh,
whatever the Sachs reading is, okay? You've imagined,